Have you ever felt trapped, as though life has placed you in an impossible situation with no way out? The story of the Exodus is not just a tale of ancient history. It's a powerful, living testament to the strength of God's promises. From the crushing oppression of the Israelites under Pharaoh's rule to their miraculous deliverance through the parted Red Sea, this story is one of divine intervention, faith, and redemption. It shows us that no matter how powerful the enemy may seem or how impossible the path may look, God always makes a way. His plan for our lives is not just about physical freedom, but spiritual transformation. Where are you watching from? Share in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on more inspiring stories like this one. Now, let's begin. In the heart of Egypt, beneath the weight of the mighty Pharaoh's rule, the Israelites lived in suffering. What was once a land of promise for their ancestors, a place where they had flourished under Joseph's wisdom, had turned into a place of oppression. The Pharaoh had forgotten their past greatness, and now the Israelites were slaves, forced to toil endlessly building the cities of Egypt, their sweat mingling with the dust beneath their feet. The cries of the oppressed rose like a chorus to the heavens, but for years it seemed as if their pleas went unheard. But God had not forgotten them. In the midst of this darkness, God had a plan, one that would not only free His people from their chains, but would reveal His glory to the whole world. He chose Moses, a man who had once lived in Pharaoh's palace, a man who had fled Egypt in shame years before. Moses had settled into a quiet life in the wilderness, tending sheep, living in obscurity. But God had not given up on him. On an ordinary day, while Moses was alone, walking through the dry hills of Midian, a strange sight appeared before him, a bush burning with fire yet not consumed by the flames. It was here, in the stillness of the wilderness, that Moses encountered the living God. The voice that came from the bush was clear, powerful, and personal. "Moses, Moses." The call to deliverance had begun. Moses was not just being called to return to Egypt, he was being commanded by God to confront Pharaoh himself, the ruler of the greatest empire on earth, and demand the release of an entire nation. The weight of this task was overwhelming. Moses, a simple shepherd, felt inadequate. He had failed before, had once fled in fear, and now God was asking him to go back, to face the very man he had once served. Doubt filled his heart. How could he, a man with no army, no weapons, only a staff in his hand, stand before Pharaoh? But God's response was simple yet profound. "I am who I am." It was not Moses' strength nor his abilities that would bring deliverance. It was God's presence. God would be with him, and that was all Moses needed to hear. The weight of God's words echoed in Moses' heart as he stood there, trembling before the burning bush. In that moment, Moses realized that it was not his own power or wisdom that would win the battle. It was God's will alone, and when God is with you, nothing can stand in your way. Yet, even with the promise of divine support, Moses hesitated. "What if they don't believe me?" he asked. But God reassured him with signs, miracles that would prove to the people of Israel that He had indeed sent him. His staff would turn into a serpent, his hand would become leprous and then healed again. And still, Moses questioned, "I am not eloquent. I am slow of speech and tongue." But once again, God promised, "I will help you speak and will teach you what to say." It was a pivotal moment in the story of Israel's deliverance. Moses, a man who had once been a prince in Egypt, now stood before God, called to deliver His people from bondage. But the journey ahead would not be easy. The road to freedom was fraught with challenges, doubts, and struggles. Moses was no longer the man who had fled Egypt in fear. He was now a servant of the Almighty, chosen to lead God's people out of slavery. But even with God's assurances, Moses struggled. In a moment of deep frustration, he pleaded, "Please, Lord, send someone else." He did not feel worthy of such a task, but God's plan was already set in motion. Aaron, Moses' brother, would speak for him. and together they would face Pharaoh. God's call to Moses was not just a call to a man, it was a call to a nation that had long suffered under the weight of oppression, whose hearts had cried out for deliverance, and whose faith had faltered in the midst of hardship. Now, God was choosing a humble shepherd to lead them into the freedom he had promised. The Exodus was about to begin. The challenge ahead would test Moses' faith, his courage, and his obedience. Yet, through it all, the promise of God's presence would be his constant companion. Moses, a man who had once lived in the splendor of Egypt's palaces, found himself standing before the burning bush, called to return to the land of his birth. The weight of God's command hung heavy on his heart. "Go, Moses," God had said, "and set my people free." But Moses, the humble shepherd, felt inadequate. He had left Egypt as a fugitive, running from the very Pharaoh who now held the Israelites in cruel bondage. The idea of facing Pharaoh again, of confronting the man who had once been his protector and now was his people's oppressor, filled him with dread. "How can I, a simple shepherd, stand before the most powerful man in the world and demand that he release a nation of slaves?" Moses questioned. Doubt clouded his every thought. His self-worth had been shattered in his previous failure when he tried to defend one of his people and ended up fleeing Egypt in fear. But God's voice, calm and powerful, echoed in his heart. "I will be with you." Still, Moses hesitated. He wasn't an eloquent speaker. He feared the Israelites would not believe him, and so he pleaded with God to send someone else, someone more capable, someone more confident. But God had already chosen Moses, and despite his doubts, God promised to equip him. Aaron, Moses' brother, would speak on his behalf, and together they would confront Pharaoh. Yet God's plan wasn't just about freeing the Israelites from slavery. It was about revealing to the world that there was only one true God, one who had the power to defy the might of Egypt, a nation that prided itself on its gods and strength. The gods of Egypt, gods that Pharaoh and his people worshipped, would soon be exposed as powerless before the Almighty. Moses stood in the wilderness, wrestling with his fears and inadequacies. He had once been a prince, raised in Pharaoh's household, but now he was a man broken by failure, filled with self-doubt. And yet God saw something in Moses that he couldn't see in himself. The Lord was not asking Moses to rely on his own strength. He was asking Moses to trust in the power of God, who would lead him every step of the way. As Moses returned to Egypt with Aaron by his side, he could still hear the words God had spoken from the burning bush. "I am who I am." It wasn't Moses' abilities that would bring victory. It was the power of the Almighty God that would move mountains, break chains, and bring his people to freedom. The stage was set. But Moses could not have imagined just how far God's plan would reach. When Moses and Aaron stood before Pharaoh for the first time, the confrontation was inevitable. Pharaoh, the self-proclaimed God-king, looked upon these two Hebrew men with disdain. "Who is the Lord that I should obey him?" Pharaoh sneered, his heart hardened by years of unquestioned authority and power. He had built Egypt into an empire that seemed unshakable, with a pantheon of gods believed to control every aspect of existence. To him, the God of Israel was a mere name, insignificant in the grand scheme of his empire. Pharaoh's arrogance was palpable. He saw no reason to listen to the demands of these two outsiders, and so he refused, his defiance echoing across the halls of Egypt's greatest palace. The Israelites, he believed, were nothing more than slaves, and he was their master. But what Pharaoh did not understand was that the God Moses and Aaron served was not just a God among many. He was the one true God, and nothing in heaven or on earth could stand against him. What followed was not just a simple series of events. It was a divine showdown between the gods of Egypt and the power of the Almighty. Moses and Aaron had not come with threats or promises of war. They came with the word of God. "Let my people go," they demanded, but Pharaoh's heart remained unmoved. It was then that the plagues began. The first plague struck the very lifeblood of Egypt, the Nile River. The water turned to blood. The fish died, and the river became undrinkable. The Egyptian people who had relied on the Nile for survival were now facing the wrath of the God they had refused to acknowledge. And yet Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. As the plagues continued, each one more devastating than the last, Pharaoh's arrogance only grew. The gods of Egypt, once believed to control nature, had no power against the will of the Almighty. The very things the Egyptians worshipped, frogs, flies, the sun, became instruments of God's judgment. The people of Egypt could no longer deny the power of the God of Israel, and yet Pharaoh still would not relent. It was clear now, this was not just a battle for the freedom of the Israelites. This was a battle for the soul of a nation, for the world to see that the gods of Egypt were false, and that there was one true God. Every plague that struck Egypt was a direct attack on their idols, their gods, and their way of life. It was a declaration that the God of Israel would not be mocked. The tension between Moses, Pharaoh, and the Almighty continued to rise. With each new plague, Egypt suffered more. But even as the people of Egypt cried out, Pharaoh's heart remained as hard as stone. He would not listen. The stage was set for the final act. Pharaoh had defied the Almighty, and now God's judgment would be complete. As we look back on this part of the story, we see the challenge Moses faced, the deep fear, the self-doubt, the reluctance to embrace the calling that God had given him. But through all of this, we are reminded that when God calls us, He does not call us because of our own strength, but because of His power. When we face obstacles in our own lives, the question is not, "Can I do it?" but "Will I trust God to do it through me?" The confrontation between Pharaoh and Moses had begun. What had started as a simple request, "Let my people go," had now escalated into a divine battle between the God of Israel and the hardened heart of Egypt's ruler. Pharaoh, a man who considered himself a god, stood defiant, unwilling to submit to any power beyond his own. But the plagues that followed would prove that the gods of Egypt were nothing but empty names, powerless before the Almighty. Pharaoh had already witnessed the Nile turn to blood, its once life-giving waters now a symbol of divine judgment. He had seen Egypt overrun with frogs, flies, and gnats, each plague growing in intensity. Yet, despite the suffering of his people, his heart remained cold, refusing to yield to Moses' demands. But God was not done. The next plague struck at the heart of Egypt's wealth, their livestock. Disease swept through the land, sparing nothing. Horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, all fell to the invisible hand of judgment. Pharaoh's priests and advisors were helpless. The gods they prayed to, Hathor, Apis, and Khnum, offered no protection. But in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, not a single animal perished. The distinction was undeniable. This was not a mere coincidence. This was the work of the Almighty. Still, Pharaoh's heart was like stone. Then came the boils, painful, festering sores that broke out on the skin of every Egyptian, from the lowest servant to the highest noble. Even Pharaoh's magicians, who had once tried to mimic God's power, now cowered in agony, unable to stand before Moses. Yet, despite their suffering, Pharaoh refused to listen. Then the sky itself turned against Egypt. Moses stretched out his staff, and the heavens unleashed their fury. Hailstones the size of fists rained down, crushing crops, destroying homes, and striking down anyone left in the open. Thunder roared, and fire streaked through the sky. Pharaoh had never seen destruction like this. His once great empire trembled before a power he refused to acknowledge. Shaken, he called for Moses and Aaron. "I have sinned," Pharaoh admitted. "The Lord is right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Pray to the Lord, for I have had enough of this thunder and hail." But Pharaoh's words were empty. The moment the storm ceased, his pride returned. He refused to release the Israelites, and so the plagues continued. A swarm of locusts followed, devouring whatever the hail had left behind. They covered the ground like a living carpet, blackening the land and leaving no trace of food. Hunger crept into the hearts of the Egyptians, and despair filled the air. But still, Pharaoh would not let go. Then came the darkness. For 3 days, an unnatural, suffocating darkness covered Egypt. It was not like the coming of night. It was deeper, thicker, so impenetrable that no one could see their own hand before their face. The people of Egypt, who worshipped the sun god Ra, now sat in helpless terror. It was as if the gods of Egypt had turned their backs on their worshippers, leaving them abandoned in endless night. And yet, in the land of Goshen, the Israelites had light. Pharaoh, for the first time, seemed to break. He called for Moses once again. "Go," he said, "take your people and worship the Lord, but leave your flocks and herds behind." But Moses did not bargain with God. "Not a hoof will be left behind," he declared. "We must take everything, for we do not know what the Lord requires of us." Pharaoh's rage boiled over. "Leave my sight," he shouted. "If I see you again, you will die." Moses looked him in the eyes and said, "You are right. You will never see my face again." As Moses turned and left Pharaoh's palace, there was an unshakable silence in the air. The final plague was coming, the most devastating of them all. God's judgment was not yet complete. The plagues of Egypt were not just acts of divine power. They were a revelation of God's justice and his sovereignty over all things. Pharaoh's heart, hardened by pride, serves as a warning to us. How often do we refuse to listen to God, ignoring the signs he places before us? The tension in Egypt was unbearable. The plagues had ravaged the land, leaving behind ruin and despair. The mighty Nile had turned to blood, the fields lay in waste, and darkness had swallowed the sun. Yet Pharaoh remained unyielding. Time and again he had refused to release the Israelites, his heart hardened by pride and defiance. But the final plague would be unlike any other. It would strike at the heart of Egypt, shattering its illusions of power and divinity. It would be the night of judgment, the night of deliverance. Moses stood before Pharaoh for the last time. His voice was unwavering, carrying the weight of divine authority. "This is what the Lord says. At midnight I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in the land will die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on the throne, to the firstborn of the lowliest servant. Even the firstborn of the livestock will perish. There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than anything that has ever been or ever will be again." Exodus 11:4-6. A deep, suffocating silence filled Pharaoh's court. His advisors trembled, for they had seen the power of Moses' God, and they feared what would come next. Yet Pharaoh clenched his jaw. He would not bow. Moses continued, his voice firm yet filled with certainty. "But among the Israelites not a single dog will bark at any person or animal. Then you will know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel." Then, with solemn finality, Moses turned and left. There would be no more warnings, no more negotiations. Judgment was coming. As the night approached, God gave Moses instructions for the Israelites, instructions that would determine life and death. Each family must take a lamb, one without blemish, and slaughter it at twilight. Take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the doorframes of your houses. Eat the roasted meat quickly, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not leave any of it until morning. Be ready, with your sandals on your feet and your staff in your hand, for this is the Lord's Passover. Exodus 12:5-11. The Israelites obeyed, their hearts pounding as they brushed the blood upon their doors. They gathered inside their homes, their children's eyes wide with uncertainty. Parents held their little ones close, whispering reassurances as they sat by candlelight, waiting. Outside, the air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. A hush fell over the land, an eerie stillness before the storm, and then, at the stroke of midnight, it began. A wind stirred through the streets of Egypt, but it carried no sound, only the invisible presence of divine judgment. One by one, in houses unmarked by the blood of the Lamb, the firstborn fell. From the palace of Pharaoh to the lowest servant's hut, cries of anguish erupted into the night. Fathers wept over lifeless sons. Mothers screamed in sorrow. Even the mighty household of Pharaoh, the self-proclaimed god of Egypt, was not spared. His own firstborn lay still in his bed, his breath forever stilled. The wails of grief rose in an unrelenting crescendo, filling the air with agony. But in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites dwelled, there was silence, not a single death. The blood of the Lamb had covered them, shielding them from judgment. As the cries of Egypt reached the heavens, Pharaoh finally broke. The palace doors burst open, and Pharaoh's messengers ran through the streets, their torches flickering wildly in the night. "Moses! Aaron! Come at once!" When they arrived, Pharaoh stood before them, no longer the proud ruler who had mocked God. He was a broken man, his face pale, his eyes hollow with grief. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Leave," he whispered. "Take your people, your flocks, your herds, everything. Go and worship the Lord as you have said." He paused, his voice breaking. "And bless me also." It was an admission of defeat. Pharaoh, who had once declared, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him?" logically now pleaded for mercy. But it was too late. The Israelites gathered their belongings in haste, their hearts racing. For 430 years, they had been slaves in this land, their cries for freedom seemingly unanswered. But now, after centuries of suffering, their redemption had come. As they walked through the streets of Egypt, the very people who had oppressed them now begged them to leave. "Go," they cried, "or we will all perish." And so, in the dead of night, the Israelites set out, 600,000 men, along with their families, their children, their livestock. They carried with them the wealth of Egypt, gold and silver given freely by those who feared the Lord's power. For the first time in generations, they were no longer slaves. They were free. That night, as the Israelites left Egypt behind, God commanded them to remember. This day is to be a memorial for you. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord for all generations to come. This was the first Passover, the night when the blood of the Lamb had saved them from death. Centuries later, another lamb would be sacrificed, not for one nation, but for the sins of the world. His blood, too, would mark the doorframes of every believing heart, shielding them from eternal judgment. This night was not just Israel's story. It was the beginning of God's greater plan for redemption. The story of the first Passover is a powerful reminder of God's justice, His mercy, and His faithfulness. Pharaoh's pride led to destruction, but those who trusted in the Lord found life. In our own lives, how often do we harden our hearts like Pharaoh, ignoring God's voice? How often do we stand on the edge of deliverance only to hesitate in fear? But the message of Passover is clear. God provides a way. Just as the Israelites were saved by the blood of the Lamb, we too have a Redeemer in Christ, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Tonight, as we reflect on this story, let us ask ourselves, are we covered by the blood of the Lamb? Have we placed our trust in the one who saves? The Israelites had left Egypt behind, but their journey was far from over. For the first time in generations, they walked as free men, women, and children, no longer bound by the chains of Pharaoh's oppression. The taste of deliverance was fresh, their hearts light with hope. Yet, as the cool desert air brushed against their faces, fear lurked just beneath the surface. Where were they going? How would they survive? Little did they know, the greatest test of their faith was yet to come. Back in Egypt, Pharaoh sat in the ruins of his once glorious kingdom. The cries of mourning had subsided, leaving only a hollow silence. His own son, his pride, his future, was gone. His people, terrified and broken, had urged him to let the Israelites go. And he had. But as he sat upon his throne, rage began to boil within him. Had he truly been bested by this Hebrew God? Had he, the ruler of the greatest empire on earth, bowed to a nation of slaves? The thought was unbearable. His grief turned to fury, his humiliation to vengeance. Summoning his generals, he made his decision. "What have we done?" Pharaoh thundered. "We have let the Israelites go and lost their services." The order was given. Chariots were prepared, weapons sharpened, and the might of Egypt's army gathered. Pharaoh would not let them go so easily. The Israelites, led by Moses, had journeyed toward the Red Sea, following the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, God's visible presence guiding them. But soon, an ominous sound reached their ears, a low, rhythmic pounding, growing louder. The ground trembled beneath them. It was the sound of hooves. Someone screamed. Others turned, their eyes widening in horror. On the horizon, a cloud of dust rose, a great force of chariots and soldiers racing toward them. Pharaoh's army had come. Panic spread like wildfire. Mothers clutched their children. Men grabbed whatever weapons they could find. But what was a walking staff against the sharpened blades of Egyptian warriors? Trapped. Before them, an impassable sea stretched to the horizon. Behind them, Pharaoh's army surged forward, ready to slaughter them all. Fear gripped their hearts, choking the breath from their lungs. "We are going to die," someone shouted. "Why did you bring us here, Moses?" another cried. "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die?" The weight of their fear bore down upon Moses, but he did not waver. He had seen the burning bush. He had seen the plagues. He had spoken with the Almighty himself. And so he stood before the people, raising his voice above the chaos. "Do not be afraid," he declared. "Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." His words carried power, not from himself, but from the one who had sent him. And then, the voice of God came. "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea and divide the water so the Israelites can go through on dry ground." With unwavering faith, Moses lifted his staff and stretched his hand over the waters. A mighty wind roared through the night, pulling the sea apart as though unseen hands were tearing it in two. The waters surged to the side, forming towering walls, standing still as if held by an invisible force. A dry path appeared where moments before only death had awaited them. The people gasped. Slowly, cautiously, the first of them stepped forward. Then another, and another. Soon, thousands were walking through the midst of the sea, the sound of waves crashing against the invisible barrier, the salty mist filling the air. They moved forward in awe, their fear melting into faith. But Pharaoh's army was relentless. Seeing the Israelites cross, he gave the order, "Pursue them!" The chariots thundered forward, storming into the very path God had opened. The hooves of horses pounded against the exposed seabed. The soldiers roared, their weapons gleaming under the moonlight. But suddenly, chaos. The wheels of the chariots twisted, grinding to a halt. Horses neighed in confusion. A great panic spread through the ranks. They cried, "The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt!" But it was too late. Moses stood on the far shore, watching as the last of the Israelites stepped onto solid ground. Then, with divine authority, he stretched out his hand once more. The wind shifted. The walls of water, once held back by the power of God, came crashing down. Pharaoh's mighty army was swallowed whole. Chariots, horses, soldiers, engulfed in the furious waves. The warriors who had terrorized them, the oppressors who had enslaved them, the empire that had defied God, all of it was erased in an instant. The waters stilled. Silence fell. The Israelites stood on the shore, their breath caught in their throats. Slowly, realization dawned. They were free. The people burst into song, their voices lifted in uncontainable joy. "The Lord is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name." Miriam, the sister of Moses, took a tambourine and led the women in dance. "Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea." It was a celebration like no other. They had not just escaped, they had been delivered. Their enemy had been utterly defeated. They were no longer slaves, they were the people of God. The crossing of the Red Sea is more than just a miraculous escape. It is a picture of faith. The Israelites stood between the impossible and the unstoppable, yet God made a way where there was no way. How often do we feel trapped, our problems closing in like Pharaoh's army? How often do we fear that there is no escape? But God calls us to trust him, even when the way forward seems impossible. He is still the same God who parted the sea. He is still the same God who delivers. The only question is, will you trust him? The waters of the Red Sea had closed behind them, sealing their escape and crushing their oppressors. The Israelites stood on the far shore, breathless, their hearts pounding with awe. Freedom, real, tangible freedom, was finally theirs. No more whips, no more chains, no more Pharaoh. They had sung, danced, and lifted their voices in praise to the God who had saved them. But what now? Before them stretched an endless wilderness, a vast, empty expanse of dust and rock. No cities, no farms, no certainty, only the promise that God would lead them to a land flowing with milk and honey. Yet freedom, they would soon discover, was not just about leaving Egypt. It was about learning to trust the one who had led them out. The journey had only just begun when the first trial arose. For 3 days they traveled through the desert of Shur, the sun relentless, their supplies dwindling. Hope turned to desperation. Lips cracked, throats burned. Then a cry rang out. "Water!" Rushing forward, they reached a pool shimmering in the heat, but as soon as they tasted it, their hope shattered. The water was bitter, undrinkable. The place was called Mara, meaning bitterness. Anger swelled among them. "What are we supposed to drink?" they demanded of Moses, their voices laced with frustration. Moses turned to the only one who could provide. Crying out to the Lord, he received an answer. Not a wellspring bursting from the ground, not a rainstorm from the sky, but a simple piece of wood. "Throw it into the water," God commanded. Moses obeyed. The water, once bitter, became sweet. The people drank. Their thirst was quenched, and in that moment, God revealed a truth they had not yet grasped. He was not only their deliverer, but also their sustainer. "If you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes," he declared, "I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." From Marah, he led them to Elim, a place of abundant springs and palm trees, a reminder that his provision was not just enough, it was abundant. But thirst was only the beginning. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, a new fear took hold: hunger. Their provisions from Egypt had run out, and there was no food in sight. The uncertainty gnawed at them, and soon their trust crumbled. "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt," they grumbled. "There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve." How quickly they had forgotten the agony of slavery. How easily they longed for the comfort of captivity over the uncertainty of faith. But once again, God did not abandon them. That evening, a flock of quail descended upon their camp, covering the ground with meat. And in the morning, as the dew lifted, something strange appeared on the desert floor. Small, white flakes like frost. They stared in wonder. "What is it?" they asked one another. Moses smiled. "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat." They named it manna, meaning, "What is it?" Heavenly food provided by the hand of God. Every morning it would appear, enough for each day. But there was a rule: gather only what you need. Those who hoarded found it spoiled, crawling with maggots. But on the sixth day they were to gather double, for on the Sabbath there would be none. In this, God was teaching them not just to trust His provision, but to rely on Him daily. Yet even with full stomachs, their faith still wavered. Not long after, another crisis struck. Once more, they found themselves without water, this time in Rephidim, where there was none at all. The desperation returned, but now their complaints turned into accusations. "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" Their anger reached its peak. "Is the Lord among us or not?" They had seen the plagues. They had walked through the sea on dry ground. They had eaten food that had fallen from the sky. And yet, they doubted. Moses, overwhelmed by their hostility, cried out to God, "What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." God, in His mercy, gave an answer. "Take your staff, the same one that struck the Nile, go to the rock at Horeb, strike it, and water will come out for the people to drink." Moses obeyed. Water gushed forth, a river in the desert. The people drank, their thirst satisfied once more. Yet this moment would be remembered not just for the miracle, but for their doubt. The place was named Massah and Meribah, testing and quarreling, because there they had tested God Himself. The wilderness was not just a journey, it was a test, a refining fire where their faith was exposed. Would they trust God for their needs? Would they believe in His goodness, even when the path seemed uncertain? It is easy to trust when miracles are fresh, when the Red Sea is still in sight. But what about when the road stretches long, when hunger gnaws, when thirst threatens? That is when faith is truly revealed. How often do we, like the Israelites, panic in the unknown? How often do we look back to our past, longing for the familiarity of our old struggles, rather than trusting the God who leads us forward? But the same God who split the sea, who made bitter water sweet, who rained down bread from heaven, He has not changed. He is still the same God who provides, the same God who sustains, the same God who satisfies. The question is, will you trust Him? The Israelites had witnessed the mighty hand of God. He had led them out of Egypt, split the Red Sea, and provided food and water in the barren wilderness. Yet their journey was far from over. They were learning that freedom was not just about escaping Pharaoh's grip. It was about trusting God for every battle ahead. And now, the next trial was upon them. The Israelites were weary. The desert sun bore down on them as they set up camp in Rephidim. Their bodies ached from endless travel and their minds were still grappling with the miracles they had seen. But before they could catch their breath, a new threat emerged. The Amalekites, a fierce, nomadic tribe known for their ruthlessness. They did not come to negotiate. They came to kill, to plunder, and to destroy. Without warning, they launched an ambush. They struck from behind, targeting the weak, the stragglers, the elderly, and the children. The most vulnerable among them, panic spread through the camp. Mothers clutched their children, fathers grabbed whatever weapons they could find, and fear settled like a thick cloud over the people. But this time, they would not run. This time, they would fight. Moses, now a seasoned leader, did not hesitate. He turned to Joshua, a young but fearless warrior. "Choose some men and go out to fight the Amalekites," he commanded. "Tomorrow, I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands." Joshua nodded, determination in his eyes. He knew this would not be an easy battle. They were not trained soldiers. They were former slaves, men who had never held swords, forced to fight against a ruthless enemy. But they had something greater. They had the God of Israel. That night, as the men prepared for battle, Moses prepared for something far greater, a spiritual war that would be won not by swords, but by faith, At sunrise, Joshua led his warriors into the battlefield, the desert sand kicking up beneath their feet. The clash of swords and the cries of battle filled the air. But on a nearby hill, a different battle was taking place. Moses climbed to the top, accompanied by Aaron and Hur. In his hands, he held the same staff that had turned the Nile to blood, the same staff that had parted the sea. He lifted it high, and as long as his hands were raised, Israel prevailed. But when his arms grew heavy, when exhaustion set in and his hands began to fall, the tide of battle turned. The Amalekites pushed forward, their blades cutting deeper, their warriors gaining ground. Moses gritted his teeth, sweat dripping from his brow. He knew that this was not just a physical battle. It was a test of faith. He could not let his hands fall. He could not let his people lose, but he was only human. Seeing Moses struggle, Aaron and Hur rushed to his side. They refused to let him stand alone. They found a large stone, placing it beneath him so he could sit. Then, standing on either side, they held up his hands, one on the left, one on the right, and together they stood firm, minute by minute, hour by hour. As the sun blazed in the sky as the battle raged below, they did not waver. Because sometimes faith is not just about standing strong. Sometimes faith is about leaning on those God has placed beside you. As the day wore on, Joshua and his warriors, fueled by divine strength, pushed forward. The Amalekites faltered, their lines breaking, their confidence crumbling. By sunset, the enemy was defeated. The battle had been won, not by the might of men, but by the power of God. As Joshua returned, sweat-drenched and breathless, he found Moses still seated on the hill, his hands still raised in worship. It was a lesson none of them would forget, but God had more to say. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this on a scroll as something to be remembered, and make sure Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven." This battle was more than just a single victory. It was a warning, a sign that those who stood against God's people would face God's judgment. And in response to the victory, Moses built an altar. He named it Yahweh Nissi, the Lord is my banner. Because this battle belonged to the Lord. The fight with Amalek was not just a historical event. It was a spiritual lesson that still speaks to us today. 1. The enemy attacks when we are weak. Just like the Amalekites attacked when Israel was tired, the enemy comes for us in our weakest moments. He strikes when we are weary, when we are vulnerable, when we feel like we cannot go on. But even in those moments, God fights for us. 2. Victory comes through intercession. The battle was not won on the battlefield. It was won on the hill, through prayer and dependence on God. The raised hands of Moses were a symbol of surrender, a declaration that they could not win on their own. In the same way, we cannot fight our battles alone. We must lift our hands to the one who holds the universe. 3. We need each other. Moses was a great leader, but even he could not stand alone. He needed Aaron and Hur to hold him up. We too need people who will pray for us, stand with us, and strengthen us when we are weak. Because faith is not a solo journey. We are stronger together. What battles are you facing today? Maybe you feel like the enemy is closing in. Maybe you feel like you don't have the strength to keep going. But hear this: God is fighting for you. Lift your hands, cry out to Him. Surround yourself with people who will hold you up, and watch how He brings victory. The journey through the wilderness had tested the Israelites in ways they had never imagined. They had seen God's power in Egypt, witnessed His provision in the desert, and learned to trust Him in battle. But now, at the foot of Mount Sinai, they were about to encounter something far greater. Not just miracles, not just deliverance, but God Himself. After months of wandering, the Israelites arrived at Mount Sinai. The towering peak stood like a silent witness to the unfolding of history. And this was no ordinary mountain. It was the place where Moses had first encountered God in the burning bush. And now, God was calling an entire nation to himself. Moses ascended the mountain, and there, in the stillness, the voice of the Lord spoke. "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." This was more than an invitation. It was a calling, a promise that the Israelites were not just freed slaves. They were a people set apart to reflect God's holiness to the world. When Moses returned with these words, the people responded with one voice, "We will do everything the Lord has said." Exodus 19:8. But they had no idea what was coming next. 3 days later, the mountain trembled. A thick cloud descended and lightning flashed across the sky. A trumpet blast rang out, growing louder and louder. The air itself seemed charged with divine power. The people stood at the foot of the mountain, their hearts pounding. They had seen God's works before, but never like this. Then the Lord spoke. His voice thundered from the mountain, and in that moment the earth shook beneath their feet, and the people, who had just vowed to obey, were filled with fear. "Speak to us yourself, Moses, and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die." The weight of God's holiness was too much. They had longed for his presence, but now they realized that standing before a perfect, all-powerful God was overwhelming. It was a lesson they had not expected. To draw close to God, something had to change. They had to become holy as he is holy. From the cloud, God gave the foundation of his covenant, the 10 Commandments. These were not just rules. They were the blueprint for a new kind of life, a life of worship, a life of righteousness, a life that reflected God's own character. 1. You shall have no other gods before me. 2. You shall not make for yourself an idol. 3. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord. 4. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. 5. Honor your father and mother. 6. You shall not murder. 7. You shall not commit adultery. 8. You shall not steal. 9. You shall not give false testimony. 10. You shall not covet. These laws were not burdens. They were a gift, a way to live in harmony with God and with one another. But this was only the beginning. The people had heard God's words. They had seen his presence. Now they had to choose. Would they truly follow him? Would they keep his commands? Would they remain faithful? Moses took the blood of a sacrifice and sprinkled it on the people, declaring, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you." Exodus 24:8. In that moment, Israel became God's people. But history would soon prove that their hearts were still unprepared. They had received the law, but they had not yet been transformed. The events at Mount Sinai were not just ancient history. They reveal deep truths about our own journey with God. 1. God calls us to holiness. The Israelites had seen miracles, but that was not enough. They were called to be set apart. In the same way, God calls us today, not just to believe in him, but to live differently. 2. God's presence is powerful. The people wanted to be close to God, but when they stood before him, they were overwhelmed. This shows us an important truth. We cannot stand before God on our own. We need a mediator, and that mediator is Jesus. 3. The law points us to grace. The 10 Commandments were perfect, but the people were not. They would fail again and again. And this is why Jesus came, not just to give us rules, but to fulfill the law and offer us grace. God has given us his word. He has invited us to be set apart, to live lives that reflect his holiness. The question is, will we accept his calling? Will we obey? Will we surrender? Will we walk in His presence? The fire of Sinai still burned. The echoes of God's voice had not yet faded. The covenant had been sealed with blood. Yet, even in the shadow of God's glory, human weakness prevailed. This was not just a moment of failure. It was a betrayal, a tragedy that would test God's mercy like never before. For 40 days and 40 nights, Moses had remained atop Mount Sinai, enveloped in the presence of the Almighty. The mountain trembled, cloaked in divine fire and thick clouds, as God inscribed the law onto stone tablets, laws meant to shape a holy nation. But down below, the hearts of the people were growing restless. Their leader had disappeared. The mountain, once a beacon of divine power, now seemed distant. The silence fed their fear. They had seen God split the sea, rain manna from heaven, and lead them with a pillar of fire. Yet, when faced with uncertainty, they turned back to what was familiar. They turned back to idols. "Come, make us gods who will go before us," they demanded of Aaron. "As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." It was a shocking request, a moment that should have been met with firm resistance. Instead, Aaron gave in. He gathered gold from the people, gold that had been plundered from Egypt as a sign of God's victory, and melted it down. From the fire, he shaped a golden calf, and then, in words that would forever stain Israel's history, Aaron declared, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." The very people who had stood in awe of God's presence now bowed before an idol of their own making. They danced, they feasted, they celebrated as though they had not just shattered the covenant they had promised to uphold. And God saw everything. High on the mountain in the presence of absolute holiness, God's wrath burned. "Go down," he told Moses, "because your people whom you brought up out of Egypt have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them." Then, in words that shook the heavens, God declared, "Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation." It was righteous anger. The people had seen miracles. They had heard His voice. They had pledged their obedience. And yet they betrayed Him. But Moses stood in the gap, not as a lawgiver, not as a prophet, but as an intercessor. "Lord," he pleaded, "why should your anger burn against your people? Remember your promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Do not let the nations say that you brought them out of Egypt only to destroy them." And in an act of pure mercy, God relented, not because the people deserved it, but because He is faithful to His promises. With the stone tablets in hand, Moses descended the mountain. He could already hear the sounds of celebration. He stepped into the camp, and his heart broke. The people were lost in idolatry, celebrating before the golden calf as though God had never rescued them. The weight of their betrayal was too much. With a mighty rage, Moses threw down the tablets, shattering them at the foot of the mountain. The covenant itself had been broken, not just in stone, but in the hearts of the people. Without hesitation, Moses destroyed the idol. He burned it, ground it to dust, scattered it into water, and forced the people to drink it, a bitter reminder of their sin. Then he turned to Aaron. "What have you done?" he demanded. But Aaron, unwilling to take responsibility, made excuses. "You know how prone these people are to evil," he said. "They gave me gold. I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf." It was a coward's excuse, a desperate attempt to shift blame. But Moses knew the truth, and the consequences would be severe. Moses stood at the entrance of the camp. His voice thundered with authority. "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." The Levites came forward, and on that day 3,000 men fell by the sword. Those who had led Israel into rebellion paid the price for their defiance. It was a moment of reckoning. Sin was not without consequence. And yet, even after justice was served, Moses knew the people were still guilty before God. Once again, he ascended the mountain. Once again he stood before the Lord, and once again he pleaded, "Oh, what a great sin these people have committed! But now, please forgive their sin. If not, then blot me out of the book you have written." But God's response was clear. "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book." Mercy had spared them, but their relationship with God had been deeply wounded, and the road to restoration would not be easy. The golden calf was not just Israel's failure. It is our failure too. Every time we doubt God's promises, we are like them. Every time we turn to things we can control, we build our own idols. Every time we let fear replace faith, we walk in their footsteps. But here's the good news. Just as Moses interceded for the people, Jesus intercedes for us. Unlike Moses, who could only plead for mercy, Jesus became our mercy. He bore our sin. He paid our price. He sealed a new covenant, one that could never be broken. And so, even when we fall, when we turn to idols, when we fail in faith, God's grace remains. Not because we deserve it, but because He is faithful. What are the golden calves in your life? What are the things that steal your trust from God? Take a moment, lay them down, and choose to follow Him fully. The weight of Israel's failure still hung in the air. The golden calf had been destroyed, but the damage had been done. The people had broken their covenant with the Almighty, and now their future was uncertain. Would God still go with them? Would His presence, the very thing that set them apart, remain among them? This was not just about a nation's survival. This was about their very identity. The aftermath of the golden calf incident was devastating. Though God had spared Israel from complete destruction, a plague had struck the camp, a painful reminder that sin always brings consequences. But now, a greater consequence loomed. God spoke to Moses, "Go to the land I promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but I will not go with you, because you are a stiff-necked people, and I might destroy you on the way." The words sent a wave of sorrow through the camp. The promised land meant nothing if God would not go with them. No victory, no land, no blessing could replace His presence. And so the people mourned. They stripped themselves of their ornaments, the very gold that had once been used to craft the idol, as an act of deep repentance. For the first time, they truly understood. God Himself was their greatest treasure. In this moment of crisis, Moses did what he had always done. He sought God's face. He went outside the camp to a tent he had set up for meeting with the Lord. Every time he entered, the pillar of cloud descended, and the people watched in awe and fear. But this time, Moses' request was not just for guidance or direction. It was for something deeper. Standing in the divine presence, he pleaded, "If you do not go with us, do not send us from here. How will anyone know that we are your people unless you go with us?" Moses understood what the people had finally realized. They didn't just need a destination, they needed God Himself. And in that moment of desperate intercession, God relented. "I will do the very thing you have asked, because I am pleased with you, and I know you by name." It was a moment of mercy, but Moses wasn't finished. His heart burned for more, and so he made a request that no man had ever dared to ask. "Now, show me your glory." Moses had seen miracles. He had stood before the burning bush. He had witnessed plagues and parted seas. But he longed to see God Himself. And God answered, not with rejection, but with an offer of divine intimacy. "I will cause all my goodness to pass before you," God said, "but you cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live." So God placed Moses in the cleft of a rock, covering him with His hand as His presence passed by. And when He removed His hand, Moses saw the back of God's glory, a glimpse of the eternal, unapproachable light. It was a moment unlike any in human history, a moment that proved that even after betrayal, even after sin, God's desire is still to be close to His people. With new stone tablets in hand, Moses once again ascended Mount Sinai. And there, in the midst of divine presence, God did something astonishing. Instead of wrath, He proclaimed His name, revealing who He truly was. The Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. It was a revelation not of power, but of character. Not just a God of judgment, but a God of unfailing love. And once again, He renewed the covenant. The people who had fallen, who had broken their promises, who had forsaken Him, were given another chance. And this time, they would carry the law not just on stone, but in their hearts. When Moses descended the mountain, something was different. His face shone, not with natural light, but with the reflected glory of God. He had spent so much time in God's presence that it had changed him physically. The people were afraid to come near him. The glow of God's holiness was too much to bear. And so, Moses wore a veil, covering his face whenever he spoke to the people, but removing it when he entered the presence of the Lord. It was a powerful symbol, a reminder that those who dwell in the presence of God are forever changed. The story of Exodus does not end with a nation reaching a destination. It ends with the people learning what truly matters. God's presence is the greatest gift. His power can split the sea. His hand can provide manna from heaven. His voice can thunder from the mountain. But without His presence, none of it matters. That was true for Israel, and it is true for us today. Jesus, the true presence of God, came to dwell among us. He made a way for us to experience intimacy with the Father. And just like Moses, we have a choice. Do we seek God for what He can do for us, or do we seek Him for who He is? What would your life look like if you truly sought God's presence above all else? Take a moment today. Lay down distractions. Seek Him, and let His presence change you. The story of Exodus is more than just an ancient tale of miracles and deliverance. It is a profound spiritual roadmap, revealing God's heart for His people and the timeless lessons that shape our faith today. As we close this incredible journey, let's reflect on the key lessons that apply not only to Israel, but to each of us. True freedom comes from God alone. The Israelites were physically enslaved in Egypt, but their hearts were still spiritually bound. Even after witnessing God's power, they often longed to return to Egypt, where life seemed more predictable. How often do we do the same? We may have left behind old sins, past hurts, and toxic relationships. But when life gets difficult, we are tempted to go back. But God calls us forward, not to return to bondage, but to walk in true freedom through Him. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Galatians 5:1. Faith is tested in the wilderness. God did not take Israel on the fastest route to the promised land. Instead, He led them through the wilderness. Why? Because freedom is not just about leaving a place. It is about changing a heart. The wilderness was a time of testing, a season where they had to trust God daily for provision, protection, and guidance. We all face wilderness seasons, times of waiting, uncertainty, and hardship. But God does not abandon us. He uses the wilderness to prepare us for the promise. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. James 1:2-3. God's presence is the greatest gift. The promised land was a blessing, but it was not the goal. When God told Israel He would send them to the land but not go with them, they mourned. Moses understood something deeper. Without God's presence, no blessing, no success, no destination matters. And this is true for us today. We can chase careers, wealth, or even good things like ministry and service. But if we lose our closeness with God, we have lost everything. Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Matthew 6:33. Idolatry is subtle but dangerous. Israel's greatest failure came not in the wilderness, but in their hearts. While Moses was on Mount Sinai, they crafted the golden calf, not as a new god, but as a replacement for God's timing. They wanted something visible, immediate, and in their control. How often do we do the same? When God seems silent, we turn to distractions, comforts, or human solutions. We create modern-day idols, success, relationships, or even ministry. Things that may be good, but were never meant to replace our full dependence on God. Little children, keep yourselves from idols. 1 John 5:21. God is faithful. Even when we are not through every failure, every complaint, every rebellion, God remained faithful. Even when Israel broke the covenant, He renewed it. Even when they doubted, He provided. Even when they failed, He led them forward. This is the heart of the gospel. God's love is not based on our perfection, but on His faithfulness. He does not leave us when we stumble. He redeems, restores, and transforms us. If we are faithless, He remains faithful, for He cannot deny Himself. 2 Timothy 2:13. Final challenge. Will you follow? The Exodus story is not just about Israel. It is about us. God is still calling His people out of bondage, through the wilderness, and into His presence. But we must choose to follow. Will you trust Him even when the journey is hard? Will you seek Him above all things? Will you let His presence lead your life? The God of Exodus is the same today, and He is still leading His people. Join the journey. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if this story has spoken to you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful Bible insights that will challenge and inspire your faith. God is calling. Will you answer?